Donald Trump has announced the operation to help commercial ships sail through the Strait of Hormuz will be paused less than 48 hours after it began. He said it's because there's been progress toward a deal with Iran and wrote on social media, "We have mutually agreed that while the blockade will remain in full force and effect, Project Freedom will be paused for a short period of time to see whether or not the agreement can be finalised and signed." The president's post comes just hours after his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, said the initial US-Israeli offensive in Iran was over, with all its objectives achieved. That's despite Iran continuing to threaten navigation in the Strait of Hormuz and the US still hoping to negotiate an end to the Iranian nuclear program. Mr. Rubio spent about 50 minutes answering questions from the media. Let's get more on what he had to say from our North America correspondent, David Willis. Hello, David. So he got quite a grilling. Talk us through it.
Yes, he did, Sally. He answered questions for quite some time in the White House press briefing room, and he announced, most crucially, the end of Operation Epic Fury. That's the basic combat mission name that was given to the US and Israel assault, if you like, on Iran. Mr. Rubio said that the focus now would be on Project Freedom, and that was a defensive operation that the United States was launching to basically guide vessels, oil tankers in particular, through the Strait of Hormuz, which, of course, Iran had also claimed it was in control of. Well, only a few minutes, a couple of hours, I should say, after Mr. Rubio had concluded his remarks and stepped down from the lectern, President Trump went on social media, Truth Social, to announce that basically Project Freedom was a thing of the past, a day and a half after it had come into operation. The president saying, as you mentioned, that he was pausing the operation in order to make time for talks between, or to capitalize on talks between the US and Iran, which he seemed to think were bearing fruit. What are we to make of all this? I mean, frankly, your guess is as good as mine. It does seem that Project Freedom, that move by the US to guide ships through the Strait of Hormuz, had antagonized Iran. They had promised to attack ships that were going through escorted by the US. But is the US on the verge of some sort of agreement with Iran over its nuclear stockpile, something that President Trump suggested might be the case in that Truth Social posting this evening? We really don't know, and the next few days may perhaps shine some light on it, or maybe not.
Yeah, interesting, David, in terms of what might happen next, because the price of oil has come down in the hope, I'm assuming, that there could be some negotiation in the near future between both sides. And of course, we've got Iran's foreign minister in China, and China may exert some pressure on Iran to reopen that strait, because for China it's very important.
Well, that's true. And of course, if you're to believe Donald Trump, then it is Pakistan that has been exerting pressure as well, Sally, seeking to get the two sides back to the negotiating table. But of course, there's only been one face-to-face negotiation between the two sides since this conflict began towards the end of February, and that resulted in the two sides walking away still a long way apart. So a lot of questions. Among them, of course, what happens to the 1,600 or so vessels still stranded in the Strait of Hormuz, some of which have been there for up to 2 months, with sailors, according to Marco Rubio, in some cases dying of starvation. We will just have to wait and see.
OK, David, thank you very much indeed. David Willis there with the latest from the White House. Well, let's now focus on Iran's foreign minister's trip to China. He is in Beijing and has begun a meeting with his Chinese counterpart. Asked about that visit, Secretary of State Marco Rubio had this to say.
I hope the Chinese tell him what he needs to be told, and that is that what you are doing in the Straits is causing you to be globally isolated. You're the bad guy in this. You guys should not be blowing up ships. You should not be putting mines. You should not be trying to hold hostage the global economy. It is in China's interest that Iran stop closing the straits. It's harming China as well.
Well, let's go live to Beijing now. Our China correspondent there is Stephen McDonnell. Stephen, so is Iran's foreign minister in meetings with Wang Yi right now?
Yes, that's right. And what we're waiting for is the official readout, which will come at some point. This is the sort of notes that both governments give us. It's not a verbatim record of what's said, but will give us the highlights of points discussed. Certainly in terms of what the governments want to tell us, though. The interesting thing about this, though, is why are they meeting face to face? Why has Iran's foreign minister flown all the way to Beijing for this meeting when these two foreign ministers have had plenty of phone conversations since the war started? And I think most analysts would say it's because it's in the lead up to Donald Trump visiting here later next week. China would love to be able to say to the US, look, we're doing our best to end the gridlock in the Strait of Hormuz. We've been having these discussions with the Iranian government on that front. Now, we heard US Secretary of State Marco Rubio saying that basically Wang Yi should be reading the Riot Act to the Iranian government, saying that you're the bad guys in all this. You should stop blocking that strait and it's because of your actions that you're essentially an international pariah. Well, the Chinese government is not going to say that Iran is the bad guy because they think that the US and Israel are also the bad guys. After all, they started the war. The official line from the Chinese government is that everyone needs to sit down and start talking. And naturally, the Chinese government wants that strait to open as well as other countries because even though this is a very strong economy, that war is also hurting China.
Yeah, I mean, China's role in all of this is very interesting in that China is seen as a friend to Iran, an ally of Iran, and yet at the same time it's got huge economic and investment ties in the Gulf, and a lot of its energy flows through the Strait of Hormuz, which is, to all intents and purposes, shut at the moment. So China is trying to mediate here in a very diplomatic way and gain points on the international stage for doing so.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And what's more, we're hearing that the Chinese government has been telling these Chinese companies which are buying Iranian oil to keep doing it, even though they're facing sanctions from the US. Now, that could also be so that when Donald Trump and Xi Jinping sit down at the end of next week and have these talks, there's leverage on that front. So both sides have got something to give, if you like. For the moment, though, China is still buying this oil from Iran, and Beijing would argue, well, why shouldn't we? We didn't start the war. We're not a party to the war. Why should we stop buying Iranian oil just because the US and Israel are involved in a conflict with that state?
OK, Stephen, for now, thank you very much indeed. Well, let's now pick the brains of the director of the Iranian studies at Stanford University, Abbas Milani. Abbas, I know you were listening in to all of that. So what do you think Wang Yi's messages for Abbas Araghchi today?
First of all, I think one message is that Iran must open the Strait of Hormuz. China has been very clear. They have repeated it several times that this is the international waterway and it should be opened. I think he might be reading the Riot Act. I'm not sure. But China is very clear on that. But China also has a lot of interest in United Arab Emirates that has been attacked by Iran repeatedly. There are 150,000, I think, about Chinese citizens who live in United Arab Emirates. I would be very surprised if the Chinese government doesn't tell Iran that they should cool their heels and stop attacking United Arab Emirates, which is a non-combatant in all of this.
But don't you think China as well is seeing this as a great opportunity, this war initiated by Israel and the US, to undermine the US on the international stage and to show China as the place of stability and collaboration?
Well, absolutely. I think China is cherishing the position that it has. It is doing exactly as you suggest. I think one of the things that the Iranians literally have been writing about as their anxiety, the Iranian regime particularly, is that China might make a deal with the United States when Mr. Trump goes there. They want to make sure that they're on the same page with the Chinese, that they won't be part of some kind of a deal. But China has extensive contacts with Saudi Arabia, with the United Arab Emirates, with Qatar, with all of the countries on the other side of the Persian Gulf. So China is sitting in a very comfortable position.
But also it has been criticised, China. There have been accusations that it's been providing military support to Iran in the same way that Russia has been seen to be doing so. But China is refuting that, isn't it?
China has refuted, but I would be surprised if they haven't given some aid, for example, intelligence, as Russia apparently has done. But that's the least you can expect of China. China has been considered Iran's chief ally in the international community next to Russia. Both of those countries, I think, have decided to sit on essentially the sideline. They have provided just enough to Iran to say that they're still an ally. But they have made their sentiments very clear that they don't think Iran is doing the right things. They might be critical of Israel and the United States for attacking, but I think they believe, for example, the attacks on the other China's allies on the other side of the Persian Gulf, closing the Strait of Hormuz, all of these things, I don't think sits well with the Chinese.
And just briefly, Abbas, do you think we could be on the verge of a deal between the US and Iran?
I would be surprised if it wasn't. I think both sides need a deal, both sides want a deal, and both sides will declare a victory after a deal where I think both of them will have probably made some concessions.
Okay. Abbas Milani, thank you again for your time.